Hi, Brennan Gaffney here, managing editor at Popular Woodworking magazine. I want to show you today a little technique I learned in school on how to stretch boards of wood, especially boards of interesting or potentially even loud wood, into something that's got a pattern to it and visually interesting. And along the way, I'm going to show you a little bit about how I shoot edges and an interesting way to glue up these panels. So I bought this board of persimmon. Actually, it was a much bigger board of persimmon. It's about a 16-foot board. I bought it because I couldn't see much of this. It was basically black on the surface. It had been air dried in a sort of wet environment and gotten some mold, but I knew there was spalting. I'd brought a plane with me to buy it, and I could just see the surface of the wood, and I thought there might be something interesting in there. So I surfaced it, and I got a look at it, and I thought I might be able to saw the faces into shop-sawn veneer until I started finding some defects I didn't like. So I've got some termite damage in the board, and while this front face looks pretty good, you can see what it looked like before I planed it there, because that's a low spot. It had some darker coloration, and it was just a little too chaotic for me to use as it was. So rather than just writing off that board and saying, well, there's 80 bucks, it was a good price, but there's 80 bucks I'm not going to use. In fact, I learned a technique while I was in school from Shin Kobayashi and Jess Osserman, who had both been students at Capella Garden in Sweden before they came to College of the Redwoods, where I learned this. They had a technique called recording that they use in Sweden quite a bit. And what recording is you take a thick slab, or it could be a thin board, but you're making more work for yourself. But you take a thick board of wood and you saw pieces through the thickness off the edges. And what that lets you do is take then each one of those pieces and flip it sideways and make a new, wider, thinner panel. They called it recording. You could also call it basically a sequential slit match. So took a slab of wood like this, and what I ended up getting was pieces like this. And now, with these pieces, if I take each one and lay them out in order, you'll see that a pattern starts emerging from the thickness of that board. And where before I had a sort of muddy, maybe ugly face, here the slit matching pattern brings a little order into the whole process. Now you'll see my panel that I glue up out of this is going to be a lot thinner. And if I were doing shop-sawn veneer, this matching would be more dramatic, because I'm losing, by making them thicker, I'll lose some of the book match or some of the slit match pattern, but it still comes through even in these thicker pieces. I rip these on a table saw. Bandsaw would also be a great choice. And so now, once I got to this stage, what I wanted to do is to make work a little easier for me down the line, I came out and I actually planned out all of my panels. Instead of edge joining these large panels and then cutting them out, I cut my pieces down into more sizable parts of these larger logs or these larger boards. So now here's all the wood I'm going to use for one of these panels. You can see that I put some Sharpie marks across the face before I resawed it. That lets me keep track, make sure everything is still in sequence. And now what I'm going to do, I'm going to take these out, and you can see I've got that nice evolving pattern. So you can see that little knot flows through the boards. Some of the spalting patterns show up, and I get some nice order in a board that before was a little ugly. So now it's time to set up for our edge joining, and I'll show you how I do that, and then we'll glue this up into its new panel. All right, so I've got my long edge shooting board here, and you can see it's 3 pieces of plywood, actually all from the same piece of plywood. I've got a base here, and that's what my plane is gonna ride on. I use some pre-finished plywood because it's sort of slick, but this can really be made out of anything. It's not a very consequential build. And then I screwed to it a platform, and that's what the work is going to sit on, and then a stop. And what I also did is I made up a little board that's going to act as a stop here. And it's just going to make it even easier for when we're shooting. One of the hardest things about long edge shooting is supporting the full piece as you're shooting it. So this stop gives us an easy way to back that piece up while we're doing that. So real quick, I'm going to put in my stop here, and I've got just 3 screws that I used. And you'll see that these screws are positioned so that the piece is supported along the full width, and you can see that's got a bow in it right in the middle. but it's supported across its full width and it's sticking out over the edge of the shooting board. Shooting these is really straightforward. We're going to check our work as we go, but all I'm doing is I'm using one hand to make sure that this piece is flush against the platform, not tilting one way or the other. And with the other hand, I'm going to press my plane. Most of the pressure of the plane is actually going to register it flat against the shooting board, not pushing into the piece, because if I push into the piece, I can end up tipping my plane one way or the other. So we're just going long shots here. You can use a straight edge to check your work. I also just use the edge of the plane as I'm going and make sure that I don't see any really big bumps. And if I do see a big bump, this makes it easy to take partial shavings. So if this had a hump in the middle here, which it actually does, I can take my plane and just take a partial shaving from the middle, another partial shaving, and then a full width shaving. And while we're at it, we're going to check it and make sure that we're staying square. After you check the first few, that's dead square there. After you check the first few, you can worry a little less about square, but when you first make this board, it's easy to make it a little tilted. The important thing there is that this platform and the base that the plane are riding on have to have the surfaces coplanar. So make sure when you screw this piece to the base, it's really screwed down tight. Also, I've got it between dogs. Don't squeeze it so much between the dogs that it bows the surface. That's easy to do. So I'm going to go ahead and shoot the 4 edges of this piece of our little panel here, and then I'll show you how we glue it up. All right, so now I've got my pieces edge jointed. I got nice tight seams, and the really important thing is that these are at 90 degrees. If they're not at 90 degrees, if it has to bend a little to join properly, we're gonna get a cupped or a bowed panel in the end, which means that we're gonna have to go even more down in thickness. And actually, the way we're gonna clamp this up, it's really gonna make that difficult. So shoot for 90-degree edges, shoot for tight joints. You can see my joints are a little sprung. That's fine. And actually with this method, it's not a bad thing at all. If you were doing this with veneer, you'd want a little less spring, or shop-sawn veneer, you'd want a little less spring. But anyway, so the first thing I'm gonna do is I wanna put a few pieces of tape, basically as I would apply clamps. So I'm gonna put one at one edge, and as I'm doing this, I'm sticking it down to one side and then pulling the tape taut and clamping it down on the other edge, and then smoothing that down. And you can see now I've got a really tight joint there. Make sure your edges are lined up or close, but obviously this is oversized at this point. Now we're gonna go to the other side, rip another piece of tape, clamp it down. Again, applying to one face, pulling the board together, and then locking it down with that piece of tape. And let's wrap those pieces underneath. And now we're gonna put one across the middle. But the interesting thing here, now this is pulling those edges. If we've done a good job on our edge joining, that's basically most of the clamping force we're gonna need here. And you'll see we're gonna do a few things to make sure it is. But now what I wanna do is, I wanna put a piece of tape down each one of these seams. And this is where this glue up starts getting interesting. So I'm gonna put a piece down each one of those edge joints I just made. This doesn't have to be particularly taut. This is actually to keep glue from squeezing through the joint as we glue it up. Oh, that piece is a little short. You want to go edge to edge with these pieces. Don't just cover the middle. Go all the way down to the other side of the board. So now we've got tape across the seams and clamping these pieces together. We're going to flip it over, and we're going to actually hang all 3 of those last pieces off. Obviously, we can't have a piece of tape coming across the front yet. And now we're going to apply glue in here, and we're going to glue it up that way, joint by joint. So let's do that, and I'll show you a few techniques to keep everything flush and flat while you're doing that. All right, so we've got our tape applied, clamp pieces, and seam pieces. And now what we're going to do is hang that first piece off, and we want something to hold this onto the bench top. I think if I let go, it will stay, but I'm worried about it moving. I'm gonna use my plane because it's nearby. I've got my hide glue here, which has been sitting in hot water and is now liquid. and I've got a paper towel. So what we're gonna do is take our glue, we're gonna apply a pretty thin bead. You don't wanna use too much glue here because you don't want too much squeeze out, but you want enough so that you know that there's glue in the joint. Just laying it on one side of the joint here, just like that, a nice thin bead. Grab a little bit at the end. And now we're just gonna take this whole first joint, fold it up, put it on the bench. And good, you can see I've got a little squeeze out there, maybe even more squeeze out than I need, but works for me. Take a paper towel and take some of that hot water I was warming my hide glue up in, and we're gonna get rid of that hide glue while we've got it here and while it's liquid. And now, the other thing I learned that Shin showed me is we're gonna use a mallet and we're actually gonna press the joint. And this is gonna keep those pieces flush and keep them at 90 degrees. But that's basically almost all the clamping we're gonna do here. I'm gonna come back in and make sure it's clean, and now we'll do the next one. So I'm gonna try to apply a little less glue this time. We'll see if I'm successful. But squeeze out is generally a good thing because it lets you know you've put enough glue in a joint. But here, because we're gonna clean up all the squeeze out immediately, we don't want too much. But of course, you also don't wanna starve the glue joint. And you can see this is kind of pushing down into place, and sometimes you'll hear it and you'll feel the friction. And so you wanna make sure you get those cinched all the way down before you move on to the next joint. You could also put weights on this side or something like that, but since this is such a short joint, if I were doing 20, I would probably have some sort of weight, probably not a plane since I'm putting water on that surface, but some sort of weight to keep this on the bench top. But now we've got that one. Use the mallet here to make sure it's nice and flush and that glue joint is all touching the bench surface. And my last joint here, and then we'll get to the final touch. The final touch is very simple. So there we go. Got our last bead of glue on, fold it up, clean it up, again, get a little more water. Scrub the joint, make sure all our glue squeeze out is out of there. Bring it home. Almost like hammer veneering, and you can even use a soft mallet just to make sure the whole thing is touching the surface. Now we're gonna grab our tape, and as a final touch, put a few clamping pieces in the same places we put the other three before. All right, so we've got glue applied. The glue is still wet and tacky, but most of the squeeze out is cleaned up. Now I'm gonna rip 3 more pieces of tape, and again, gonna use that same clamping action I used before. So I'm pulling it taut and then smushing that piece of tape across and getting a good taut joint there. And I'm gonna do it for these other 3 positions here. Don't need to start at either end because it's already being clamped from the other side, but this is really insurance, and to make sure that this is gonna stay together as it dries in case it gets knocked off or we put it on a surface that isn't level. So there's the 3rd piece of tape, and now this can sit. You'll see all the squeeze out was forced to this face. Got no squeeze out on this side. Where that comes really in handy is if this were shop-sawn veneer. We have such a thin thickness in shop-sawn veneer, it might be between an 1/8 and a 1/16, that we really can't afford a ton of squeeze out because we can't do a lot of cleanup. So on this thicker piece, I'm not so worried about the squeeze out, but it's still gonna save us some time. So I've got another panel I prepared earlier, and I'll show you how we're gonna dress it, and then we're done. So now we've gotta let this panel sit up probably overnight, and then in the morning, what we'll do is we'll come back in and we'll surface it. I planed these first and then I sanded them. This piece was unique because we had some sort of knots and even a little rotten wood, but that's fine. Hand planed it down, smooth it with sandpaper, apply finish to it, and it's gonna be great. Once it's dry and surfaced, then is a good time to bring it down to your final dimensions. These should get stickered just like all of your wood for your projects so that it dries evenly, but especially while it's in the glue, you're gonna wanna put it somewhere with even airflow over the top and the bottom. So, hand plane it, sand it. You can see I've got a lot more to do for my bookcase that'll be coming up in a future issue of the magazine. So, it's a really great technique. You can see you can use what might have been some pretty ugly wood and turn that into decorative, interesting panels. So I think it's a great technique, and I'd love to see what people do with it. So I hope you found that helpful, and happy woodworking.